Hello Internet, I'm Jackie Fox, and for the next few videos, we're going to be talking about the Ukraine-Russia conflict, as well as a number of other conflicts and how they relate to this, taking us on a trip around time, around history, and around the world itself, trying to decide how past events may influence this. I'm going to try to take the generally broadest perspective possible here, but also the broadest variety of perspectives. So no one should expect this to be particularly orthodox, and don't expect it to be particularly short either, because, oh boy, there's a lot to cover. And first, the obvious disclaimer that since certain parts of this are going to be referencing an ongoing humanitarian crisis in the world, and one that is sometimes developing very quickly, we're getting new updates all the time in our information about how things are going on the ground, and how different geopolitical powers are acting. In preparation for this series, I've watched footage of the Finnish president, the German diplomats. I've seen perspectives from all over the world. I've seen all sorts of stuff from Ukraine as well. And I want to say I've not been on social media for any of this. And with the exception of the YouTube community tab, looking at certain people who were rebroadcasting certain social media and on-the-ground news highlights from Ukraine, I really haven't throughout the whole process. So I haven't actually seen a lot of the fake news that people have made videos about. The video game footage being insinuated to be happening in Ukraine, those kinds of things. With the exception of the Ghost of Kyiv. That one is particularly popular across the board. And as it pertains to that, I don't really care that that's fake news. I mean, it's a cool story, and if that motivates you ultimately, maybe the Ghost of Kyiv should not go down in history for being much more than a meme. Because they don't exist, obviously. Anybody who knows about, like, ace pilots and that kind of thing, you know this just can't be real. But at the same time, it's probably incredibly motivating for certain people. And there's a long history of war memes and their use in times of crisis in the military. For example, there was the "Kill Where He Was Here" meme that spread all over the world even in the pre-internet age. Perhaps even being one of the first memes to reach a global spread. Because this is an ongoing crisis, we're going to be starting in the history. There's a lot of people who have talked about certain aspects of geopolitical history, kind of things like political power, soft power, hard power, proxy wars that we engage in, and why all of these things might affect this situation, or how they might provide illustrative parallels. My frustration in this is that history is complicated, and people often just reference a part or a statistic of a particular conflict, instead of studying how the entire conflict might be illustrative. That's more the perspective that I'm going to be taking during this series. There are a lot of long-running consequences of the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, for example, that are especially relevant now. Even beyond just the way people are talking about this, like, oh, the Soviet Union got their asses kicked in the Middle East over the course of a decade by Afghanistan. And yes, that is probably politically relevant, but it's also worth letting the story of that invasion play out. You know, how other countries are involved. And what are the lessons that Russia should have learned from this? What are the lessons that Americans should have learned from this? It's also worth talking as well, though, what lessons did the Afghan people learn from this? And where does that put them in the modern day? I think these are all incredibly relevant questions. And also, I guess it makes sense to get this out here first. I mean, I've made several videos already referencing manufactured consent before this. And I think that discussing one of those frameworks could be important in relation to this story. If you're on top of world news, especially if you're in my left-wing audience, I keep talking like I have right-wing viewers. I really have no idea. Let me know in the comments where you fall on the political spectrum and why you subscribed. But anyways, for my left-wing viewers, you've probably been hearing a lot about the American-backed Saudi genocide that's happening in Yemen right now. You may know that there's an estimated 13 million people in that country that are starving right now. And it seems like there's no side of the political or even mainstream media that platform the idea of supporting, say, Palestinians over Israel. Because for our government in general and our corporate structures, both parties have their alliances with Israel. We only see the fringes actually talk about what's happening to the Palestinian people. and the slow invasion that has been happening in Palestinian land for decades. It never really makes that many headlines here. In fact, it's more likely to make a headline that someone was willing to speak out about it. And for the most part, we certainly don't talk about Yemen either. And then in Afghanistan right now, one of the reasons I think it's important to ask how these geopolitical events got us to where Afghanistan is because the Afghan people are starving as well. In part because the Taliban don't strive to have good governing priorities, for one. They don't seem to be very concerned as much about human welfare and more typically Western liberal values, to say the least. And they're definitely not capital L liberal in political philosophy. It seems like this particular interpretation of Sharia law reigns with an iron fist there. And at the same time, when the US left Afghanistan, we took all the money from the Afghani government, and we just left with it. And we're still holding it to this day. And that money is frozen in what's effectively a sanction against the Taliban. Which is kind of a weird place to be, because I can't say for certain if you give them that money. And I think there should probably be preconditions on this as well. Like maybe give them half of it with the stipulation that they spend 80% of that feeding people. And then give them the rest if they do so. You know, I'm not really sure how much they would use to actually feed people if we didn't. Or to feed women. I don't know. I just don't understand what their priorities are. I do think we need to give them the money back in one way or another, though. And maybe preconditions are a good way to go to make sure this situation doesn't remain a humanitarian crisis. But one thing is for certain. As long as the US holds on to these funds, 0% of them, none of them, can be used to feed any civilians. That's for certain. And like how we're seeing people starving in Yemen right now, we're literally seeing people starve to death in Afghanistan. Like mothers, pregnant mothers, are starving to death. I mean, what can we say for their babies? They're being born premature and distinctly underweight, because no one has the food to feed even a pregnant woman. That is the state of the country. And unless you listen to more left-wing media and analysts such as myself, or as opposed to the mainstream news, or maybe you listen to public broadcasting like PBS or Al Jazeera or NPR, maybe some of these sources discuss it. But really, you don't much hear about that. And for the most part, we've ignored the very real creeping invasion into Ukraine for the last 8 years now, with the exception of briefly caring about Crimea. But in the 8 years following that, we never really covered what happened in the Donbass. And when we did, we often referred to it more in the context of a civil war, or just kind of ignored that it was happening at all. And it's also worth noting that this would align us ultimately with the Russian propaganda about the matter, instead of seeing this as an attempt at a Russian-backed coup. So right now, after Vladimir Putin declared Donetsk and Luhansk independent of Ukraine, these two areas making up much of the Donbass, it's kind of weird, because he doesn't have any authority over Ukraine, for one. You know, it's like if he came to America and said, hey, California is now an independent state. Deal with it. But to tie this back to manufacturing consent, it's interesting how we seem to be worried about this all of a sudden. From the perspective of Chomsky, this might be because, in the eyes of the media, we have chosen to make Ukraine worthy victims. Which doesn't mean they did anything to deserve to be victims. But that as victims, they are worthy of our care and compassion, as opposed to unworthy victims, which do not warrant our attention, such as people starving in Afghanistan, people starving in Yemen, such as the people who are losing their ground day by day in Palestine. We ignore these because the media has determined that they are unworthy victims, that it's not worth it to care. And it's just so wild how abruptly everyone seemed to care. Everyone started to care that there was a humanitarian crisis in the making, when there are already active humanitarian crises going on. And in fact, this was an active humanitarian crisis before everyone and their mother decided to cover it on the news. Now, personally, as you can probably tell from the fact that I'm going to do at least this video, if not a series, on the kind of things that would lead to these sorts of humanitarian crises that we are seeing here, you can you should be able to tell that I think that all of the victims of these war crimes are worthy of our care and compassion, including the people of Ukraine, but not simply just Ukraine. So if you're one of the people who is asking yourself why all of a sudden the media thinks that we need to take this humanitarian crisis very seriously, you could say, and from the authors that I've read defending this in the mainstream media, there's this kind of narrative that seems to hinge upon a single word: European. Which has to be some sort of a small comfort to Ukrainians. But it also shows how shallow their designation as a worthy victim is. Because the Ukrainian people didn't necessarily think of themselves as a European country until relatively recently. And I'll be damned if the rest of the world has acknowledged it. Are they in the EU? Are they in NATO? No. For the most part, we don't think of them as a European country. We don't necessarily think of them as a Soviet country either. We think of them as being Ukraine. More importantly, the media and our political leaders often just don't think of them at all. So it's kind of weird that all of a sudden all of these reporters are saying that Ukraine is a European country. Because until this invasion happened, it felt like the world and the media were kind of uncertain as to whether they wanted to call Ukrainians European. And yes, I'm talking about the reaction largely in European countries. That's largely what I've looked at in addition to America. And one thing that all of these countries have in common with Ukraine is that they're predominantly white. And conversely, of all our unworthy victims, including groups like the Islamic Uyghurs in China, what they all have in common is their brown skin. It's not so much that I think that this is really the reason, though I do think that our general pattern of behavior does support at least discussing this perspective, because I can see how it looks that way. And there probably is something to that. But you could also say that the reason why we had such a uniform and different reaction to this is because it's such an obnoxious and clearly unjustified act of aggression. I feel like even though it's one of the most propagandized countries in the world, I think even most Russians realize, and have realized from really early on, that this war is unjustified by anything that Putin has said. And we'll be talking about all the things that he said in his speech to attempt to justify this invasion further out in this series. I think the most important thing here is that the crisis can be leveraged against a long-standing geopolitical competitor, Russia. For most of the West, it seems like we've all wanted a reason to make them our official enemy for a long time. Just look what we did with Russiagate, for fuck's sake. And I mean, there was smoke there. There just wasn't the fire that we reported. I covered the smoke myself, and on that note, there is an element of the Mueller report that I do want to bring into this, actually. I haven't heard anyone else talk about it, and while there's an interesting parallel to be found there, before we get into all of that, and as a way of getting into all of that, let's talk about the history. Talking about Ukrainian history and their progress towards independence, you could really choose any point in time. Because it's not like they haven't been living on this land for centuries. But Ukraine got its name alongside its statehood under the Soviet Union in the early 1900s. The Russian Revolution of 1917 led to the founding of the Soviet Union under the Bolsheviks, and a subsequent civil war in Russia. A Ukrainian national movement for self-determination emerged in this time, under socialist influences. Several Ukrainian states briefly emerged. The internationally recognized Ukraine People's Republic, the predecessor to the modern Ukraine, was declared on June 23rd of 1917 by the First Universal of the Ukrainian Central Council, proclaimed at first as a part of the Russian Republic. After the October Revolution, the independence of the Ukrainian People's Republic was proclaimed on January 22nd, 1918, by the Fourth Universal of the Ukrainian Central Council. Compared to the US or the EU, Ukraine had less independence as a state than a US state would, and considerably less than a member of the EU, which is unfederated. though the United States could probably have been a lot more like the Soviet Union in terms of federal-state power balance, if not for our history of a somewhat balanced federalist-anti-federalist philosophy throughout the formative history of our union. So this is where that story starts. It's also where Putin's pre-invasion speech starts. So I guess it makes sense to start here from a chronological perspective like I am in this series. But it also seems to set the floor for this assertion that giving these states even that level of independence was a mistake by the Soviet Union, at least from Putin's perspective. And basically it seems like the preferential placement in that speech, it seems like this might be the first step in an attempt to correct that mistake, as if history itself did not happen. And in terms of what he declared in that speech that he was going to do and what he actually did, there's a gulf wide enough to pass an entire Russian invasion through. Even Russian soldiers have begun to realize that this isn't what they were being told they were getting into, which, along with poor conditions for what they're being asked to do, has led to thankfully low morale among Russian soldiers who are now in Ukraine. That being said, they have plenty of soldiers, and the soldiers that are coming into this situation now perhaps have a better understanding of their actual missions on the ground. So they're less likely to be demoralized, the way the first to the front lines were. Though, even with a better understanding of the situation, there are still familial ties at play here, giving the dispute some of the dynamic of a civil war and a proxy war at the same time. Just imagine showing up to the front lines like, I think that's my cousin. I'm pretty sure I see them at family reunions. I'm not going to shoot them. They are not a soldier. This is a civilian. One of the reasons I find Ukrainian history so fascinating is Euromaidan, which is my favorite portion of this whole thing. And I fell in love with the country watching now President Zelensky on Servant of the People, which seems to be trending right now. I've been recommending it to you for years, but as an actor and now as a besieged president, I think he's doing a good job. Now, it is important to note that he had some issues after he was elected in terms of consolidation of presidential powers, some dark money connections, and in fact his popularity was starting to wane. However, his messaging changed. It became a lot more humble and down to earth and less like a typical Ukrainian politician around the time this invasion began. And I mean, for one, America is kind of, we're doing our political fanboy thing, which is kind of weird, where we just kind of lust after half-decent political leaders. Like, does anyone remember Cuomo-sexuals? And I mean, he's not even a half-decent political leader. We just freaked out over him for no reason in the middle of the pandemic. Like, while he was shielding companies from being sued for killing the elderly with COVID. We don't have the best taste, is what I'm getting at. But also, that while Zelensky may have had his issues in the middle of his presidency, he's doing a more amazing job here right now than I think anyone could have reasonably expected for him, or really any leader, to do. Again, he deserves praise for what he has done since the invasion started. And at first, as a president, I thought he was too good to be true. I thought he was acting, He is an actor by trade. I thought about Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump, and when I thought about him at first. But he's really shaping up, and more importantly, showing up, as the same kind of down-to-earth and proud Ukrainian president that he once played on TV. And I think that that's really playing to his strengths. Now, compare him to the corrupt Russian and oligarch-backed president that was overthrown by popular demand as a part of Euromaidan. In attempting to step away from the growing relationship with Europe and realigning Ukraine with Russia, he was standing in the way of a growing pro-European zeitgeist. During Euromaidan, many Ukrainians, especially those in the West, took to the streets to show their support for closer ties with Europe. Meanwhile, in the more predominantly Russian-speaking East, there were some who opposed the Euromaidan protests. instead supporting the Yanukovych government and their policy of restoration of ties to Russia. Over time, Euromaidan came to describe a wave of demonstrations and civil unrest in Ukraine, the scope of which evolved to include calls for the resignation of President Yanukovych and his government. Violence escalated in the middle of January 2014 when the government accepted new anti-protest laws. Anti-government demonstrators occupied buildings in the center of Kyiv, including the Justice Ministry building, and riots from February 18th to 20th left 98 people dead, with approximately 15,000 injured and 100 missing. On the 21st of February, President Yanukovych signed a compromise deal with opposition leaders that promised constitutional changes to restore certain powers to parliament and called for early elections to be held in December. Petro Poroshenko, running on a pro-EU platform, won this election with over 50% of the vote, therefore not requiring a runoff election. While this is common and expected in our electoral system, it's uncommon for a candidate to win in the first round of an election in Ukraine. It's also worth noting that Volodymyr Zelensky won in the first round with 74% of the vote, which is even more uncommon. Upon his election, Poroshenko announced that his immediate priorities would be to take action in the civil unrest in eastern Ukraine and to mend ties with the Russian Federation. In the following October 2014 parliament elections, Petro Poroshenko's bloc Solidarity won 132 of the 423 contested seats, giving his government even more consolidated power. With this, the people of Ukraine had seized back their future, and they'd used it to reach out to allies and comrades in Europe. One of the things that was most interesting about this protest, and one of the things that gets some of the more orthodox leftists mad, really gets their panties in a bunch, is that during this movement there were a lot of Lenin statues that were taken down by force. And they were all over the country. During the Soviet era, they put up a lot of statues. And this is in part because a tendency towards a cult of personality within Soviet communist government. So this was a visible sign of the realignment in the streets and a powerful symbolic act by the movement in making their messages heard and seen. This was a very clear declaration that this might be our history, but these statues need not be our future. As an American living in the South, I found that relatable a number of times during the last decade, though admittedly there weren't any statues of Lenin in the southern US. Though this decision would be propagandized by Putin, used as a justification to invade both Crimea and the Donbass, it strikes me as the last gasp of a once great empire, watching its influence wane, its sphere of influence being pushed back to its own borders over the decades since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Let's bring a few other points of history into our discussion. So at the end of World War II, we began this nuclear escalation that basically redraws the whole world under new imperial lines. You'll have what I'll typically be referring to as the West or the Western Cold War Alliance, and then you have the Soviet Union being one of the players in what you could think of as the Eastern Alliance. I don't think that either side was particularly communist. Some efforts were made and some went wrong so much faster than others, and some much more fundamentally. But there are interesting lessons to be learned here. There are experiments that show attempts at communism, and they have their mistakes that we can learn from, which is in part why I approach my personal core political perspective on the world from more of an anarchistic view than necessarily a socialist or communist one. Because at least in practice, communist socialist principles, as we have seen them executed on a large scale, tend towards authoritarian regimes, and I'm just not a fan of that. I think it has its benefits, but also definitely its detriments. Feels a bit like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, even though there are some things that these type of countries, especially China, as a particularly interesting example, even though it's not a country that I think is necessarily going in the right direction, but they have showed some interesting capabilities from the fact that they're a state-planned economy, and one that survived the Cold War as well. And that organizing your country this way is showing some interesting benefits in the face of large-scale problems that the West should be envious of. It's not perfect, and obviously what they're doing is still very capitalist, but I have digressed for too long. We redefined the world within these imperialist lines of thought and established a new series of proxy groups. And from these, we really have to talk about the formation of NATO. Now, NATO, the North Atlantic Trade Organization, is nominally a trade organization. I mean, it's in the fucking name. Couldn't be much clearer about that, except that it never really was intended to be this. And you can tell from the way that we're talking about it in the context of Ukraine. Like, when have you heard NATO referenced in the context of trade in the last year? No. It's also a defensive military alliance designed to stop the Eastern Alliance from taking any more ground. Point worth repeating that nuclear war is still a serious existential threat to mankind. Due to this, the Cold War had a very different flavor, and that stems from this collective agreement that we don't want to push this imperial pissing match to extinction, or trigger that series of events. So because of that, direct military confrontations between different groups of countries, especially NATO, we're basically dancing around NATO because this alliance was so effective, that NATO nations couldn't get involved in the conflict directly against nations like Russia, because if any one of them were to do so, it would draw them all into the conflict, and suddenly you have the potential for worldwide extinction. This way of thinking leads into the nature of the Cold War itself, a binary conflict in nature that played out predominantly through proxy wars in states less central to the conflict, and often by nature not as directly connected to the two empires that were fighting it out here, using the more neutral citizens of the world and their countries as our human shields, while committing horrendous war crimes on both sides, leading to numerous series of escalations that could have easily led to our extinction had one thing played out differently. And while we're traipsing through time, there is an important proxy battle that was fought that I think really bears discussion in relation to this, and that is the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. This isn't so much a story about Russia, though. It's a part of Afghani history that's still playing out today, even though it started in the 1970s. In 1973, an Afghan coup d'etat was led by Army General and Prince Mohammed Daoud Khan against his cousin, King Mohammed Zahir Shah. This happened on July 17th and resulted in the establishment of the Republic of Afghanistan under a one-party system led by Daoud. For this coup, Daoud led forces in Kabul along then Chief of Staff General Abdul Karim to overthrow the monarchy while the king was abroad in Italy. King Zahir Shah decided not to retaliate, and he formally abdicated the throne on August 24th, remaining in Italy in exile, ending more than 2 centuries of royal rule. At the time, this was described by staff in the United States National Security Council as a well-planned and swiftly executed coup. In 1978, the Communist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan seized power in what was called the April Coup, or the Tsar Revolution, against then-President Khan. The PDPA declared the establishment of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, with its first leader being named as People's Democratic Party General Secretary Nur Muhammad Taraki. The coup marked the end of the power of the Barakzai dynasty after 152 years. The revolution was initially welcomed by people in Kabul who had been dissatisfied with the Daoud government. This revolution was ordered by the PDPA member Hafizullah Amin, who would become a significant figure in the revolutionary government. At a press conference in New York in June 1978, Amin claimed that the event was not a coup, but a revolution by the will of the people. The coup involved heavy fighting and resulted in as many as 2,000 deaths, both military and civilian. The Tsar Revolution was a significant event in Afghani history, marking the onset of 43 years of conflict in the country. At first, this new government took a more moderate approach. However, from late October, the PDPA launched drastic reforms that struck the socio-economic structure of rural Afghanistan, which at the time was mostly tribal. It prohibited usury, although it didn't have in place any alternative for peasants who relied on the traditional, if exploitative, credit system on the countryside. This led to an agricultural crisis and a fall in agricultural production. Land reform itself was criticized for confiscating land in a haphazard manner that enraged everyone, benefited no one, and reduced food production. And this has been claimed to be the first instance of organized nationwide repression in Afghanistan's modern history, which very well could be true given the nation's previous tribal nature. The PDPA was an advocate of equal rights for women, and quickly declared the equality of the sexes in Afghanistan. A major Marxist-Leninist leader and member of the Revolutionary Council wrote a famous editorial which declared, "Privileges which women, by right, must have are equal education, job security, health services, and free time to rear healthy generation for building the future of the economy. Educating in," and then went on to say that educating and enlightening women is now the subject of close government attention. The PDPA pushed hard for reform and was brutal in repression of the opposition, arresting many without charge. The regime alienated a wide variety of people, including tribal and clan leaders, Islamists, Maoists, Western-educated teachers, and traditional religious leaders. The first anti-government revolts began in Kunar province in October of 1978. It's also worth noting, and this was ultimately a tension that would be exploited by the CIA later, but a lot of people just weren't happy with the fact that this was a secular government, as they wanted a more traditional Islamic government. By September of 1979, PDPA General Secretary Taraki was assassinated. General Secretary Taraki, which again is like their president, was assassinated in an internal coup orchestrated by Amin, which is his second coup for those keeping track. And he then assumed control of the People's Democratic Party. Amin was known for his independent and nationalist inclinations, but was also seen by many as a ruthless leader. He has been accused of killing tens of thousands of Afghani citizens in national prisons, while cracking down on both opposition and the Parshamites. 27,000 politically motivated executions reportedly took place in a single prison. Afghans generally held Amin personally responsible for most of this repression, while the Soviet Union considered his government illegitimate, discredited, and doomed to collapse in a civil war. They were also displeased with Amin's coup of a government that they had formed a military treaty with under Taraki, and the Soviet army invaded the country in December of 1979, heading for Kabul, killing Amin just 3 days later. A Soviet-organized regime led by Babrak Karmal, but inclusive of both moderate and reformist factions within the country, filled the vacuum. Soviet troops in more substantial numbers were deployed to stabilize Afghanistan under Karmal, marking the beginning of the Soviet-Afghan War. The United States and Pakistan, along with smaller actors like Saudi Arabia and China, continued supporting the rebels, delivering billions of dollars in money and weapons. Lasting 9 years, the war caused the death of between 562,000 and 2 million Afghans, and displaced about 6 million people who subsequently fled Afghanistan, mainly to Pakistan and Iran. This was and is very typical of the US playbook. We saw that tension. We saw a chance to fight Russia in Afghanistan through a proxy. So starting with Jimmy Carter, we started funding a group called the Mujahideen, or essentially those who are engaged in jihad, through the CIA's Operation Cyclone. Yeah. Interesting to know that we did that, right? I mean, especially for people my age, who were born after the Soviet collapse, but before 9/11. So when I found this out, obviously, I was quite shocked. I was very much politically raised in a post-9/11 America, so my instinct when I hear those engaged in jihad is to think, Oh my God, death to America, right? Like, all the terrorism and stuff. Oh my God, worst people in the world. Obviously the most violent extremists. Jihad. Because that was very much the tone politically that I was raised in. So it seems surreal to find out that only like 20 years prior, or even closer to 12 years prior to 9/11, we were funding those engaged in jihad, and that we paid them for nearly a decade. We funded them in 3 waves overseen by various US presidents throughout the 1980s, with our total aid package being valued at around $10 billion at the time, and in doing that, the groups of the Mujahideen expanded. Essentially, it went on a hiring spree. And I mean, holy shit, we were like the angel investors of the Afghan theocratic terrorist resistance. And we didn't care that these people had no interest in establishing a democracy. Although it's worth pointing out that the PDPA was only nominally democratic, it was just another one-party state, really. Their only goal here was to overthrow their own government in order to implement the authoritarian theocracy that we currently decry in the West. Like what we've been saying is humane and unconscionable for 2 decades are their practices, and we gave them the power to have that power of state. We delegitimized a state that cared about equality of the sexes, while that has been one of the biggest ways that we have discredited the kind of theocratic leadership that we ultimately propped up. And when we stopped funding them, a number of things happened. Several groups that were the most committed to overthrowing Middle Eastern governments and replacing them with this sort of strict theocracy formed a movement that would call itself the Taliban. And these were directly formed from the remnants of the Mujahideen. Those who didn't go to the Taliban, many of them were recruited by one of the other financiers. See, it wasn't just that they were getting this money from the government or from the US government. There were also financiers, wealthy financiers from Saudi Arabia, for example. And you may remember one of their names, Osama bin Laden. So Osama says, the US military isn't going to pay you to do jihad anymore. Why don't you come over to my side? I promise I'll make it worth your while. And with that, it would be about 3 years before Al-Qaeda would carry out its first anti-American imperialist terror attacks. And to a certain point, a lot of the connections and funding for Al-Qaeda came in through Saudi Arabia. Not necessarily from what it looks like, from what I can tell without being super politically versed in the religious tensions in that specific area. It seems like the Saudi government probably wasn't involved, but that doesn't mean that groups within the country weren't without official permission from the Saudi royal family. So in order to fight Russia now, you can look at this as a very similar case. From both perspectives, we have similar dynamics here in Ukraine. Essentially, we have Russia trying to come in and overthrow the government, and on the other side, we have NATO forces who can't engage with Russia directly, using all kinds of techniques to arm Ukrainian civilians over the last decade in order to create a proxy war scenario now. And this is also, they don't necessarily have to put their necks on the line. And this decade of lethal aid approved by Presidents Obama and Trump, although both of them allegedly used this aid as a political bargaining chip in one way or another, this era helped the US military-industrial complex by finding homes for a lot of their guns. And in America, we really care about this problem of having too many homeless guns. I'm not saying they weren't given to a good home. I'm just saying that these Javelin missiles we see being used to take out tanks are very expensive. Someone is profiting very heavily from the US sending Javelin missiles. And I'm critical of the military-industrial complex because I think most of the things that it involves itself in, like Yemen, are unjustified. Iraq, Afghanistan, there's plenty of examples of this. But this is what's justified, at least from the perspective of coming to Ukraine's defense. In summary, things have gone really badly for Afghanistan, and by extension the whole Middle East, because the radicals we funded in this proxy war spread and became one of the greatest threats to global peace in the 21st century. But what of the fallout for America? Clearly, our decisions through the CIA can easily be blamed for the rise of Taliban and subsequently ISIS, which formed almost exactly the same way under US funding before escaping our control. So, let's face it, that's a lot of blame. Think about how many countries ISIS expanded into, each one having a reason to distrust us, even when we're there saying we're trying to help. And this provided the motivations for attacks on America since. I'm not saying that things like 9/11 were justified. I'm not saying that retaliatory violence is ever really justified. I'm not saying that terrorism, invasion, or imperialism are ever really justified. But it's not complete insanity that they would target the US in particular. They didn't just pick a country out of a hat and say, okay, we're starting the jihad with the United States of America. So it is. It was, in many ways, that retaliation to the horrible imperial choices made during Operation Cyclone. We've talked about the American and Afghani fallout from the Soviet-Afghani War, but what happened to the Soviet Union, the other side? Well, 10 years of being bogged down and trying to take control of the Afghani government, they fought almost exactly the same imperial war that we've been fighting for the last 20 years in Afghanistan, only at twice the speed and around 4 times the casualties per year. And this was notoriously a clusterfuck for us, both in terms of perceived legitimacy of our government, trust in the government, military-industrial complex, etc. There's so many places in the world right now that have plenty of reason to view us as villains. And as we'll eventually talk about in this video, both Chinese and Russian propaganda take plenty of advantage of this. Western anti-United States, anti-imperialist propaganda seems to have a pretty big grain of truth to it sometimes. I mean, yes, it is being used as propaganda, but at the same time, if we didn't do this kind of shit, we wouldn't be making it so easy for them on messaging. They really would have to be making stuff up about us to make us look bad. And they don't really, and that's the sad part. This is part of what made Russian propaganda channels like Russia Today so odd. A lot of times they're mostly telling a truthful story, but in the most negative way they can, distorting the facts or omitting context wherever needed to make us into the typical scheming villain. Anyways, the Soviet Union was very spread thin by this. The 10-year engagement pretty much forced the economy to collapse, and a commonality that I've seen in Russian leadership over the last 100 years, and perhaps even longer, is that often in sort of pissing matches between imperialist forces, Russian leaders don't particularly seem to mind their economy going to such a place that their people are starving. It just doesn't necessarily seem to bother them. Maybe this can be seen a little bit more generously as a side effect of the harsh and cruel weather conditions and realities of living in the Russian lands. But you could also see it as pretty heartless too. So the collapse of the Soviet Union went on for too long. When people started starving in the streets, it's probably a good time to, reduce the military budget, quit engaging in foreign wars. They could have peacefully withdrawn from the rest of the world and focused on keeping their citizens alive. Had their economy not collapsed, the Soviet Union might have made it through the 1980s, just like China. It could have happened. But in part, because of Afghanistan and its 10-year quagmire, they would never come close to winning. When the change of powers happened in Soviet Russia became just Russia, the Soviet Union of the Soviet state of Ukraine became Ukraine in 1991, officially declaring its independence. As all of this is happening, and as the starting point for this independence, all of the people are starving and desperately poor. And this is in part because of sanctions. This is in part because of military and because it seemed like the best way of winning the war smoothly, without a nuclear engagement, was to play economic uncle and keep raising the stakes in proxy wars and just shoveling excesses of money and weapons into both, while hitting them with sanctions, any opposition we could to overwhelm their economy. And then it worked. It took a long time, but it worked. And that doesn't mean that this strategy didn't have its own brand of civilian casualties. The strategy did help us avoid nuclear war, but it also created a large amount of human suffering in its own way. All of these new governments of Russia, Ukraine, all of them, they're all being formed in this new world of suffering. And what happened especially in Russia, I don't necessarily know whether or not this happened in Ukraine per se, but I assume similar things happen because you end up with a similar situation afterwards. But the Soviet Union distributed its ownership because this was the type of communism where the government owned everything, not the people. And they actually became communist for just a minute by literally giving the people the means of production through vouchers for a share of the state industry. Sounds great. But what happened? Well, it wasn't money, for one. Money was already massively devalued. And because of inflation, food is expensive. No one had the money to pay for it. So naturally, what most did with these vouchers was say, how can I trade this for money? How much money can I get? And that was the thing on the tips of every former Soviet's tongue as they started to be handed out. And the people who were just wealthy enough that they could still eat, they offered them pennies on the dollar, while they consolidated a massive amount of industrial power, especially in the energy sector. This formed the wealthy oligarchs that would eventually get into power, and this is largely because of the corrupt strings that allowed them to do such things as hold state auctions in which the doors were locked and only a single oligarch was allowed into the room. Only a single bid was ever taken. And with only that oligarch bidding on whatever was at bid, it suddenly became theirs at a rock-bottom price. And in the early history of independent Ukraine, it had a similar oligarchy-powered flavor, which was highly corrupt. And, to the detriment of Ukrainian people. It just was not a good start for independence. And the Ukrainian people fucking hate it. They hate it to this day. And what remnants of it remain and largely kept the status quo from 91 into the 20-teens was that these oligarchs, a lot like the Russian oligarchs, were aligned very closely with the Russian state. Therefore, this was kind of like a nominal independence. Many were beginning to feel like Ukraine was becoming that puppet state of Soviet powers once again. In 2004, Viktor Yanukovych, then prime minister, was declared the winner of the presidential elections, which the Supreme Court of Ukraine later ruled had been largely rigged. The results caused a public outcry in support of the opposition candidate Viktor Yushchenko, who challenged the outcome. During the tumultuous months of the Orange Revolution, candidate Yushchenko became gravely ill and was soon found by multiple independent physician groups to have been poisoned by dioxin. Yushchenko strongly suspected Russian involvement in his poisoning. All of this eventually resulted in the peaceful Orange Revolution, which brought Yushchenko and Yulia Tymoshenko to power, while casting Yanukovych in opposition. This is where Yanukovych's story makes a strange intersection with America by way of an Atwater-era Republican strategist named Paul Manafort. First officially started working with Yanukovych and his pro-Russian Party of Regions in 2006, acting as a political consultant helping to burnish the party's tarnished image after the Orange Revolution, for primary elections later in that year. Manafort molded Yanukovych and the other members of his party into a more presentable politicians, down to even advising them on their hair and clothes, according to a Washington Post report on Manafort's work in Ukraine. U.S. diplomats in the country sent a cable back to the State Department in 2006, observing that the Party of Regions was shifting from a haven for Donetsk mobsters and oligarchs into something more polished looking. With thanks to this assistance, Yanukovych returned to power in 2006 and was then re-elected in 2010. Manafort stuck with Yanukovych over the course of his tumultuous presidency, which included the jailing of his chief political rival, Yulia Tymoshenko, in 2011. Manafort, however, denied involvement in any of the actions taken during the revolution, such as the violent crackdown on protests. One of Manafort's firms also ran a lobbying effort in Washington to court better press coverage and more favorable public opinion for Yanukovych's administration during this time. But even after Yanukovych fled Ukraine following Euromaidan, Manafort continued to work as a political consultant for the party, helping it after it became the newly renamed opposition bloc in 2014 parliamentary elections. Over the course of Manafort's time in Ukraine, he allegedly made himself incredibly wealthy while flouting international tax and lobbying laws. Ukraine's Anti-Corruption Bureau found handwritten ledgers that showed $12.7 million in payments to Manafort from Yanukovych's Party of Regions from the period of 2007 to 2012. Manafort would then return to the US to provide similar services and expertise to the Trump campaign, although I feel like he didn't provide nearly as much advice on how Trump should wear his hair. Then again, his hair is pretty iconic. Anyways. What about all that ill-gotten money? Scrutiny brought against the Trump administration for corruption would see that all of the above crimes revealed when he was indicted in 2017, with charges claiming that Manafort had failed to disclose both his status as a foreign agent and his foreign bank accounts despite nearly a decade's worth of involvement in Ukrainian politics. Manafort was prosecuted in not one but two federal courts. In August 2018, he stood trial in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia and was convicted on 8 charges of tax and bank fraud. Manafort was next prosecuted on 10 other charges, but this effort ended a mistrial, with Manafort later admitting to his guilt. In the United States District Court for the District of Columbia, Manafort pled guilty to 2 charges of conspiracy to defraud the U.S. government and witness tampering, while agreeing to cooperate with prosecutors. Also, fun fact, the U.S. has frozen Yanukovych's U.S. assets by sanction and banned him from entering the country. Not like recently either, but enough about either of them. Let's talk about what took him down. The Maidan or Euromaidan protests started in November 2013 after President Yanukovych began moving away from an association agreement that had been in the works for the European Union, and instead chose to establish closer ties with the Russian Federation. However, members of parliament voted on the 22nd of February to remove the president and set an election for May 25th to select his replacement, a move described by Russia as a coup, and appears to be the reason that Vladimir Putin began preparations to annex Crimea later in the year. That March, Putin directed Russian troops and intelligence agents to disarm Ukrainian forces and take control of Crimea. Following the invasion and disarmament of Crimea, a controversial referendum was held in March of 2014, and the official result was that 97% wished to join with Russia, which is a suspiciously high number that has not been recognized by many international agencies at this point. However, I also haven't necessarily heard that this election was fraudulent quite in the same ways that the 2004 election of Yanukovych. Putin then annexed the country using the vote for legitimacy. In the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, armed men declaring themselves as local militia and supported by pro-Russian protesters seized government buildings, police stations in several cities, and held unrecognized status referendums similar to the ones being held in Crimea, but without the same overwhelming support for annexation that Crimea had shown. This insurgency was led by Russian emissaries Igor Girkin and Alexander Borodai, as well as militants from Russia, such as Arseny Pavlov. They proclaimed the self-styled Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic to have controlled about 1/3 of the oblasts in the last 8 years. Russian forces have fought as well as trained and supported these separatists, as they've held the same or similar front lines for the entirety of the engagement, which is equal parts civil war and proxy war. Ceasefires are agreed upon and violated predominantly by the Russian-backed separatists on a daily basis for years. These are the contested borderlands between Ukraine and Russia in the east, the same ones that were declared independent just before the beginning of the invasion. It was this particular invasion, which started in 2014, that Vladimir Putin declared victory in February of 2022, ordering military forces to enter the breakaway Ukrainian republics, calling this act a peacekeeping mission. He decided that he already had enough control of these two regions that he could declare them independent, even though it's not his country to be declaring things independent in. So there is an ignored 8-year invasion of Ukraine by Russia that happened all through the 2010s, and this was capped off with the declaration of independence of those two regions, following their cap. While our governments funded this proxy war, we heard little or nothing about it for 8 bloody years, until finally this disaster became far too big to ignore. And now the whole world has begun to pay attention. And finally, it's about fucking time. While we're paying attention, it's worth noting that a similar invasion to that first invasion in Ukraine is also currently happening in the former Soviet state of Georgia. Just worth mentioning, I don't know a ton about it, except that it's both less violent, but also more directly being done by the Russian military. And before we get off on this topic in this particular period of time, there's an interesting parallel between the things we discovered in the Mueller report and the first invasion, in that a big part of the Russian propaganda effort on both on its own citizens, as well as Ukrainian citizens, although it wasn't ever very successful in Ukraine on that front for the last 8 to 10 years. But largely what they've been trying to do is push and amplify actual organic separatist movements. And the funny thing is that they were literally doing the same thing here while they were doing this in Ukraine. And the evidence of this was detailed in the Mueller report. Particularly the ones that I remember the most, although there were other states that were mentioned in the report in relation to this. Russian state-aligned actors did things ranging from pumping Calexit and Texit hashtags to organizing distant events on Facebook. Like, they make the page, start the event, they get real-world Americans to show up to these kind of AstroTurf protests. I'll say that again, we have evidence that Russian actors used Facebook to set up real-world American protests. And I feel like these are pretty interesting because there were people who wondered why the organizers never showed up to these things, and always said, oh, I have to be out of town at that moment. So Russians were effectively getting real US people who had their own good faith reasons for supporting state-level succession, but amplifying their voices inorganically. And largely, this is the exact same playbook that they've been doing for the last decade in Donbass. Russian disinformation, Russia's relationship with the media, which I mentioned before, is truly fascinating and horrifying. It's really hard to say that Russian citizens trust any media within the country, because it's just the way that a sense of theirs lies on both sides, which is probably very familiar to my American audience. And so much of it is state-controlled, though with the frequency of state agents making prominent positions on cable media, or even the cable media taking their story directly from the state account of things, you could say this is also familiar to us. But in Russia, there is controlled opposition as well to state media, and both of them lie. So it just makes it really impossible for Russians to feel like they can get truth within the mainstream media. But those who do follow a narrative, those who do think that there's something on Russian news that's worth believing, and follow this narrative that has been presented by Russia, that there are Nazi groups in the Donbass. And we'll talk about this claim in a bit as we're talking about justification. But they've also heard that there are huge Russian separatist protests and that these displaced Russian citizens just want to be a part of Russia again. This is just the Crimean playbook all over again. Except that in this case, they could never get the votes required to legitimize their annexation efforts.